Everyone says the SAT reading and writing section is just about practice, practice, practice. But what if that's completely wrong? What if I showed you the way that my students and nearly every high-scoring student think about each SAT question so they never waste hours grinding? That's what this video is about. We'll start with the writing section. It only has 3 question types you need to master: standard English conventions, transitions, rhetorical synthesis. Let's begin with the biggest one. Standard English conventions. Here's what most students don't realize. Standard English conventions isn't just one type of question. It is actually 2: form, structure, and sense, and boundaries. So how can you tell which one you're looking at on test day? It's simple. If the answer choices look like different word forms, so basically verbs changing tenses, single versus plural, or slightly different versions of the same word, that's a form, structure, and sense question. If the answer choices are different punctuation marks, so periods, semicolons, commas, colons, dashes, then that's a boundary question. Let's start with one of the easiest form, structure, and sense questions: the single versus plural verb type. Most students waste a whole minute on these and still get them wrong, but you can solve them in 3 seconds with what I call the 3-second test, also known as the they-it test. Here's how it works. Take the verb in the answer choices and test it with they and it. For example, I see that these are different forms of the same word underlie, meaning that it is a form, structure, and sense question. So I'll use the 3-second test. Choice A. Do you say they underlies or it underlies? It underlies, so it is singular. Choice B. It is underlying or they is underlying? It is underlying, so it is singular. Choice C. It underlie or they underlie? They underlie, so it's plural. Choice D. It has been underlying or they has been underlying? It has been underlying, so singular. 3 of these choices are singular. Only one underlie is plural. Since that one is the odd one out, then choice C is correct. Notice what we just did. We didn't even read the full sentence. We only tested the answer choices with the they-it test, and the odd one out was correct. Boom, done in 3 seconds. But does this trick always work? Not exactly. Sometimes both they and it fit. For example, suggested. Do you say they suggested? Yes, you can. Do you say it suggested? Also yes. So here the they-it test fails. That means it's not about singular versus plural anymore. It is a verb tense question. So how do you solve those? Let's go step by step. Sometimes 2 choices share the same verb tense, and shortcuts like they-it test don't work. That's where my 8 verb tense rules come in. These are rules every SAT student should know. Most students know a few, but not when to apply them. Take a screenshot of them if you want, and let's go through each one with examples. You can skip to this moment over here if you don't want the explanation. Present simple, or the one that I call the fact and habit tense, is used for facts, habits, or current truths. For example, the lamp illuminates the glass. That's a fact, it always happens. You'll sometimes see words like now, usually, and always for this type of tense. The next verb tense you need to know about is past simple, or the story tense. Past simple is for completed past actions. For example, he vowed to conserve nature. This already happened. Sometimes the way you can know if you should use this verb tense is there's lots of past dates and there's a completed past action. Next up is past progressive. I sometimes call this the interrupted tense. Why? Because past progressive describes an ongoing past action interrupted by another. So for example, she was studying when she discovered another thing. She was in the middle of studying and then another event happened. So there was an interruption here. And you'll usually see words such as while or when included when this tense is used. Next up is past perfect, or the before past tense. We use past perfect when one past event happened before another. So for example, by the time they had completed the project, the group had doubled in size. So there is one past action which is doubling in size, and it was completed before another, which was finishing the project. And sometimes you'll see words such as by the time or before with this tense. Next up is present perfect, or the bridge tense. The reason I call this the bridge tense is because it connects the past to the present, past action with current relevance. For example, I have read that chapter. So you have read it, however, you're mentioning it now as it still matters now. and you'll sometimes see words such as already, ever, or yet. So for example, I have read that chapter already. Next up, we have future simple, or I call it the future tense, which is pretty self-explainable. Future simple is for actions that will happen. For example, you will learn more tomorrow. And of course, you'll see some signaling words such as tomorrow, next year, or later, or anything in the future. Next up, we have infinitives, or I call it the to-do tense. Infinitives are to plus verb. They show purpose or intent after certain verbs. For example, they decided to include the game. Here, to include shows purpose. Next up, we have present participle, the background info tense. Present participles are verbs ending in ing. They give background or ongoing action, not the main verb. That's why I call it the background info tense. For example, walking through the forest, she admired the trees. The main action is she admired the trees. The phrase walking through the forest just gives the background information. Now, back to our example. Since the action was completed in the past, the correct choice is past simple. That makes choice A correct. Another common form, structure, and sense question is what I call defining noun sentences. Officially, they are called modifiers, but I'll just stick to my name. These test whether you recognize what's being described. How to spot them? The answer choices are usually long. The format is description, comma, and the noun or noun phrase being described. Here's an example. Based on events that occurred when Rabanal was a city-state ruled by a king. Okay, so after that comma, we need the thing being described. Let's check the choices. Choice A. Rabban al-Achi tells a story of Akichi Achi, a military leader who... This works. Why? Because the description is about events, and immediately after we have the noun Rabban al-Achi, which tells a story. Choice B. Kichi Achi, the military leader in the story of Rabban al-Achi. This is wrong. Description was about the story, not the leader. Choice C. The military leader. Again, wrong. It does not match the description. Choice D. There was. That doesn't even start with a noun or a noun phrase, so it's automatically incorrect. That leaves choice A as the correct answer. Next up, we will discuss possessive noun questions, and they're some of the easiest to recognize on the SAT. You'll know it's one of these questions when the answer choices shuffle apostrophes around, sometimes before the S, sometimes after the S, and sometimes missing altogether. Here's the golden rule. Ask yourself, does the thing after belong to the thing before? If yes, use an apostrophe. If no, don't use any apostrophes. If yes, then check whether the word is singular or plural. If it's singular, then the apostrophe will come before the S. If it's plural, the apostrophe will come after the S. So let's go through an example. Racetrack-like trails in the playa sediment mark the rock's mysterious migration. Now let's test the answer choices. So step 1. So I can see here it says playas and some of them have an apostrophe, some don't. So how do I know if there should be an apostrophe or not? Well, step 1 is to ask, does the sediment belong to the playa? Yes. So the sediment belongs to playa. Therefore we need an apostrophe, and that means we can eliminate choice A. Now between choice B, C, and D. Choice D has playas with an apostrophe after, which means it is plural. But in the passage it says playa, which is singular. So choice D is wrong. That leaves B and C. What is the difference? Choice B only makes playas possessive, while choice C makes both playas and rocks possessive. So we check the next part of the sentence. The rock's mysterious migration. Does the mysterious migration belong to the rock? Yes, it does. Without the apostrophe, mysterious migration would just float with no owner. So if I say mysterious migration, it wouldn't make sense. However, if I say the rock's mysterious migration, it would make sense. Therefore, the correct answer is choice C, because it uses an apostrophe. Now we will move on to the second half of standard English conventions, boundaries. These are punctuation questions, and they test whether you know how to separate different kinds of clauses. The key idea is the sentence independent or independent dependent. So, what do I mean by this? If both sides of the sentence can stand on their own and make sense on their own, you have 3 correct options. Period, semicolon, or comma plus fanboys. Fanboys are for and, nor, but, or yet so. For example, the digital SAT is taken on a computer. Does that make sense on its own? Yes, meaning it's independent. And it says the test feels stressful no matter the format. Does that make sense on its own? Yes, it does. Therefore, both sides are independent, meaning in between them, there can either be a period or a semicolon or a comma and a fanboy. However, if only one side makes sense on its own, then you cannot use a period, semicolon, or a comma plus fanboys. For example, although the deadline was approaching, did you see? I felt like something was missing, something was supposed to come afterwards. So when something does not make sense on its own, then it is dependent. What about the line after? It says the team remained confident in their project. This makes sense on its own and it's fine. However, this means that the question is in the independent dependent format. So one of them makes sense on its own while the other does not. For this specific example, the correct choice would be a comma. Now let me show you an SAT question. So in here it says roughly 300 nights a year, when the cold air descending from the Andes meets the warm air rising from Venezuela's coastal lake Maracaibo, the result is a spectacular lightning storm. It strikes so bright, so localized, and so dependable. Okay, yeah, depending on the way you read it, this kind of makes sense on its own. Okay, then it says that it has become known as Maracaibo's lighthouse. No, that does not make sense on its own. So it is in the independent dependent format, meaning that we cannot pick the choice with the period, semicolon, or comma plus fanboys. However, we only got semicolon over here, so let's cancel that out. Now let me read it again. The result is a spectacular lightning storm. It strikes so bright, so localized, and so dependable that it has become known as Maracaibo's lighthouse. Yeah, there are no pauses actually, so we can cancel out the choice with the comma as well. We're now left with choice A and choice C, but I'll just straight up tell you that it is choice C. I'll explain the 3 key rules that must be present for us to use the colon later. So boundaries aren't just about periods and commas. The SAT also tests semicolons, dashes, colons, relative clauses, and type name structures, and more. So let's just go through each. Semicolons. So we use semicolons in 2 cases. First of all, to separate 2 independent clauses. We have talked about this already. And secondly, to separate items in a complex series. I'm not going to confuse you by talking about complex series questions a lot, but I'm just going to tell you how to solve it correctly. If you ever see a semicolon followed immediately by the word and, then it is a complex series question, and the correct choice is the one with the semicolon. Now let's discuss dashes. Dashes follow 2 rules. They always come in pairs, 0 or 2, never 1 or 3. And the second thing you need to know is the information inside the dashes is extra. If you remove it, the sentence should still make sense. So for example, we can see that there is a dash in the choices and there's only one dash in the text, meaning the correct choice is the one with a dash, so choice D. And also the information inside the dashes is extra. If you remove it, the sentence should still make sense. So, in a 2023 study, researchers documented the fascinating behavior in the aquatic plant Elodia densa. When exposed to low levels of light, the plant's chloroplasts reshuffled to form a tightly packed glass-like surface ideal for collecting more light. So you see, it still makes sense. That's how you know dashes are being used correctly. You might see on another question like this that has one dash in the entire text and there is no dashes in the choices. Well, that is because the dash is at the end of a sentence, meaning that the part after the dash is extra information, but you do not need to focus on this. I just want to mention it because on almost all of my videos where I discuss dashes, I see a student ask about this. However, just stick to the rules I told you. So there has to be 0 or 2 dashes, and anything in between dashes is extra information about the thing before the dash. We'll discuss this specific question later on though. Now we will talk about colons. For a colon to work, 3 rules must be true. So the part before the colon must be an independent clause. So in this case it says the number of jams available for tasting varied. Yes, this makes sense on its own, so it is independent. Therefore, rule 1 works. Then the part after must start with a noun or a pronoun or a noun phrase. A noun, for example, is garden. A noun phrase is the big and beautiful garden, and the pronoun is it, he, she, they, and so on. In this case, it says some shoppers, which is a noun phrase. So rule 2 works. Next up, the part after must explain or give an example of the part before. So the line before says the number of jams available for tasting varied, while the line after the blank says some shoppers had 24 different options, others only 6. So the part after explains the part before, so basically how it is varied. meaning that rule 3 also works. All three rules check out, so the colon is correct. Next up, we will discuss relative clauses. A relative clause is a noun or a noun phrase plus a comma plus extra information talking about the noun or noun phrase plus a comma again, and then the rest of the sentence. If the extra information is removed, the sentence still makes sense. So for example, and here it says, photosynthesis, the mechanism by which plants use sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into nutrients, is fueled in part by an enzyme called photosystem 2 that harvests energy-giving electrons from water molecules. So the line in the middle just gives extra information about photosynthesis. So let's see if we can remove the middle part and if it still would work. So it would be photosynthesis is fueled in part by an enzyme called photosystem 2 that harvests energy giving electrons from water molecules. So this still works. So that means the commas are correct. Next up, we'll discuss type names. So this is when you have a type, then an example of that type. Then there is no punctuation needed. So usually there is a job title, then the name of the person that has that job title. For example, biologist Yurei Lee. So because there's first a job title, then the name of a person that does that job title, then it is a type name question. So there's no punctuation required, meaning we'll pick the choice without any punctuation. Next up, you have defining noun sentences. And yes, it is the one that we explained earlier in the form structure and sense questions. However, the main difference over here is that it tests for punctuation. So we know that defining noun sentences are made up of a description, then the comma, and then the thing being described. So over here it says, while one requires oxygen and one does not, comma, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so this was the thing being described, and this was their description. So one of them requires oxygen and one does not. That's the description, comma, and thing being described. Of course, so choice C is correct. Sometimes the line after the blank is a defining noun sentence. However, you might get tricked into thinking that this is just a continuation of the line before the blank. So what do I mean by this? Let's take a look at this question over here. It says, on July 23rd, 1854, a clipper ship called the Flying Cloud entered San Francisco Bay, having left New York Harbor under the guidance of Captain Josiah Perkins Creasy and his wife, navigator Eleanor Creasy. A mere 89 days and 8 hours earlier, the celebrated ship set a record that would stand for 135 years. Okay, this means that it is connected, so we probably cannot have a period in between them, right? Wrong. This is how defining noun sentences trick you. So, to avoid falling into this trap, always check if the line before and after the blank are independent. So you could say, on July 23rd, 1854, a clipper ship called the Flying Cloud entered San Francisco Bay. Okay, does this make sense on its own? Yes, it does. So it is independent. Having left New York Harbor under the guidance of Captain Josiah Perkins Creasy and his wife, navigator Eleanor Creasy, a mere 89 days and 8 hours earlier, the celebrated ship set a record that would stand for 135 years. So, did you see? That also made sense on its own. So it is in the independent format, meaning that we have three options to choose from: a period, a semicolon, or a comma and a family. In this case, we have a period, so you'll choose that. By the way, I just opened my SAT English Accelerator program. It's designed to help students improve their English scores drastically in the shortest amount of time. If you're feeling stuck, practicing non-stop, but still getting the same questions wrong, or if you think you know your weaknesses but can't seem to fix them, then this program is built for you. Inside, I'll guide you step by step with proven strategies so you don't waste time guessing what works. Most students who join boost their score by 80 to 170 plus points in just 1 to 2 weeks. And that score boost could be the difference between missing out or getting into your dream school. So if you need real results fast, click the link below and let's get started. Next up, we will talk about transition questions. Most students think transition questions fall into three broad categories: cause and effect, contrast, and continuation. But the SAT doesn't really test those vague buckets. Instead, it's about knowing the exact definitions of 20 to 30 common transition words. If you know them, you can predict the correct answer more than 80% of the time before even looking at the choices. When you understand the meaning of the transition, the question practically solves itself. So take a screenshot of them if you want. Or if you want, you can join my free community to get the PDF version of this where I explain these transitions in more detail. So now I'll show you some questions. Alexander Lawrence Posey varied his focus and tone depending on the genre in which he was writing. In his poetry, he used heartfelt language to evoke the beauty and peacefulness of his natural surroundings. In his journalism, he employed humor and satire to comment on political issues affecting his Muskogee Creek community. So the line after the blank is opposite of the line before the blank because in the first line it says how he used heartfelt language to evoke the beauty and peacefulness, while in the line after it it says how he used humor and satire. These are opposites, so the correct transition must show contrast. The right choice would be something like by contrast or however, and so on. So now you might say, well, then transition questions do fall under cause and effect, contrasting, and continuation. Well, some questions, yes, but if you know the meanings of all the words, you could basically eliminate the chances of you making mistakes. So let's look at this next question. In the 1880s, inventor Louis Latimer improved upon Thomas Edison's design for the electric light bulb. Blank. Latimer made the bulb more durable by placing cardboard around its carbon filament. With this innovation, Latimer became the first black inventor to contribute to the electrification of the world. So the line after explains what was previously stated in more detail. So the first line says Latimer improved the design, while the second line explains how he improved it. So when the sentence gives more specific detail after the blank, we use specifically. That is why you need to know about all of the transition words, so you can predict the answer before even checking it. Here is one last question. Try to see if you can solve this one. Award-winning travel writer Linda Watanabe McFerrin considers the background research she conducts on destinations to be its own reward. Blank. McFerrin admits to finding the research phase just as fascinating as exploring a location in person. So the sentence after the blank emphasizes the previous sentence. It confirms it even more. So when something gets confirmed even more, we use in fact. So choose D. So transition questions aren't just about guessing, cause and effect, contrast, and continuation. They're about understanding the context of the text and knowing the meanings of each word and when they are used. Because if you don't, then how will you know which choice to pick? So again, once you understand the exact definition of the word, the question is straightforward. Next up, we will talk about bullet point questions. These are the questions where the SAT gives you a setup with bullet points or long descriptions and then asks you which choice best fits the purpose. Most students waste time reading all the bullet points, but here's the secret. In about 80% of these questions, the stem of the question already tells you exactly what to look for. If you focus on the question stem, you can often skip the bullet points completely. So let's go through a few examples. The student wants to emphasize the thoroughness of Ida Tarbell's investigation of the Standard Oil Company. Now let's check the choices. Ida Tarbell not only interviewed Standard Oil executives, oil industry workers, and public officials, but also examined thousands of pages of the company's internal communications. This clearly shows how much work she did and how detailed her investigation was. This matches the question perfectly. Choice B. Ida Tarbell, who investigated Standard Oil Company, was a muckraker, a journalist who sought to expose corruption in the U.S. institutions during the Progressive Era, 1897 to 1920. This just defines the word muckraker. It doesn't show how thorough she was. Choice C. As part of her investigation of Standard Oil Company, muckraker Ida Tarbell conducted interviews. This mentions interviews, but does not show the depth of her work. Choice D. Published in 1904, muckraker Ida Tarbell's book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, exposed the company's unfair business practices. This explains the outcome of her book, but not the details of the investigation. So the correct answer is choice A, because it shows that her investigation was detailed and thorough. Let's look at this next question. The student wants to introduce the scientist and her field of study to a new audience. Choice A. Located in Brazil, the Amazon reef is one of the largest known coral reefs in the world. This just describes the reef. No scientist is introduced, so this is wrong. Choose B. Marine biologist Camille Jasmine Gaines studies coral reefs, vital underwater ecosystems that provide homes to 25% of all marine species. Perfect. It introduces the scientist Camille Jasmine Gaines and her field studying coral reefs. Choose C. Providing homes to 25% of all marine species, including up to 8,000 species of fish, coral reefs, are vital underwater ecosystems and thus of great interest to marine biologists. This talks about reefs in general, but does not introduce the scientist. Choice D. As Camille Jasmine Gaines knows well, coral reefs are vital underwater ecosystems providing homes to thousands of species of fish. This assumes the audience already knows who she is, but the question specifically says to introduce her. Now we'll move on to the last and final bullet point question and the last and final writing question. The student wants to specify the reason the Mayflower Compact was created. Choice A, stating that its signatories wanted to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. The Mayflower Compact was a legal agreement among the Pilgrims who immigrated to Plymouth Colony. This states what the Pilgrims wanted, but not the purpose of the compact itself. Choice B. Created in 1620, the Mayflower Compact states that the Pilgrims wanted to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Again, this is about where they wanted to settle, not why the compact was created. Choice C. The Mayflower Compact was created to establish a common government among the Pilgrims who immigrated to Plymouth Colony. Yes, this clearly gives the reason why it was created, to establish a government. Okay, choice D. The Mayflower Compact had 41 signatories, including John Carver, the first governor of Plymouth Colony. This just lists names, not the purpose. Therefore, choice C is correct. So now that we are done with the writing section, let's start the reading section. And the first reading question type I'm going to talk about is the one that almost every single student struggles with, which is words in context, or those vocabulary questions. Here's the passage. During a 2014 archaeological dig in Spain, Vincent Lol and his team uncovered the skeleton of a woman from El Algar, buried with a valuable object signaling high power. This finding may persuade researchers who have argued that Bronze Age societies were ruled by men too. So, what should go in the blank? Well, if the finding shows a powerful woman, then the researchers who said only men rule might now have to admit or believe women could rule too. So that's our prediction, which is to admit or to believe. Now let's check the choices. To waive, it means to refrain from insisting. So this does not fit. Concede means to believe after denying. Perfect. Because it means to now believe or to now admit. Refute, to prove wrong. This is the wrong direction because they're not trying to prove them wrong. Require, we all know what require means, and it does not make sense here. So the correct choice is choice B. Notice we didn't just guess. We predicted first, then matched. I know most of you are struggling with the meanings of the words, so I've posted a list of about 130 key vocabulary words in my free community. And those words alone cover 80 to 90% of the words and context questions that are difficult. But let's test another style of vocab. Underline instead of blank. Mr. Brooke had traveled in his younger years and was held to have contracted a too rambling habit of mind. His conclusions were as difficult to predict as the weather. So maybe that means that he evolved to have a very unpredictable habit of mind. So contracted here probably means created or evolved. So let's look at the choices. Choice A, restricted. No, it was not restricted. It was created or evolved. Choice B, described. No, this is wrong. Choice C, developed. Yes, this means it evolved. So choice C is correct. What about choice D, settled? No, it did not settle. So words in context is about using the restatement built into the text. Now let's move on to something people don't talk about as much, but many students get these questions wrong, which are function of the underlined sentence questions. For these questions, I have read the underlined sentence first, and I ask myself two questions. First, what is this? Is it a conclusion, a claim, some information, an introduction, a question, or an example? Then I ask myself, what is a simple summary on what this sentence is about? Here's the underlined sentence. Jin Shang Zhuang, Hong Kong-based import-export firms, likely coordinated the fish transport from Chinese-operated fisheries in Vietnam and Malaysia to North American markets. So, first of all, what is this? It is information providing some evidence. Second, what is a simple summary on what this sentence is about? It is about how Hong Kong trade firms handle fish transportation. So now that we understand the premise of the underlined sentence, let's check the choices. Choice A. It explains why efforts to determine the country of origin of the items mentioned in the previous sentence remain inconclusive. So the underlined sentence does not explain inconclusive efforts. It gives information providing some evidence. So this is wrong. Choose V. It provides information that helps support a claim about the discovery's significance that is presented in the following sentence. I guess that could be true. However, we would need to read the line after the blank. This route reveals the often overlooked multinational dimensions of the trade networks linking Chinese diaspora communities. So it says this route, which is referring to the route in the underlined sentence. So, yes, the underlined sentence provides evidence that supports the following sentence's claim about the multinational dimensions of trade networks. Choice C. It traces the steps taken to locate and recover the object described in the previous sentence. So, no, there are no traces being taken here. Choose D. It outlines a hypothesis that the additional evidence discussed in the following sentence casts some doubt on. No, the following sentence supports or elaborates. It does not cast doubt. So choose B is correct. And this is why you always try to find what the sentence is doing, because that is literally what the question is asking us. It is asking us to find the function. Now, let's move on to my favorite question type, overall structure questions. The reason why it is my favorite question type is because I always predict exactly what the answer is going to say, even before checking them. So, how do I do this? Well, I use the paper method. Let me show you what I mean. Mathematician Claude Shannon is widely regarded as a foundational figure in information theory. This line introduces a famous man. I'll use the paper method to write this down on the scrap paper I'm given on Thursday. Next, it says his most important paper, A Mathematical Theory of Communication, published in 1948 when he was employed at Bell Labs, utilized a concept called a binary digit, shortened to bit, to measure the amount of information in any signal and determine the fastest rate at which information could be transmitted while still being reliably decipherable. So I'll write down on the scrap paper that this says what he did or what the famous man did. And it says Robert Gallagher, one of Shannon's colleagues, said that the bit was Shannon's discovery, and from it, the whole communications revolution has sprung. This says that some people were saying how amazing his accomplishments are. Therefore, the correct choice will tell us about the famous man, then what he did, then it will tell us about some people saying how amazing his accomplishments are. Let's look at the choices. Choice A. It presents a theoretical concept, illustrates how. Nope. It first presents a famous man, not a theoretical concept. Choice B. It introduces a respected researcher, yes. Describes an aspect of his work, yes. And suggests why the work is historically significant, yes. Therefore, I think choice B is correct. However, let's see the other choices. Choice C. It names the company where an important mathematician worked. Nope. It first tells us about the mathematician and not a company. Choice D. It mentions a paper, offers a summary of the paper's findings. Again, no. It first tells us about the mathematician and not a paper. See how easy these overall structure questions become when you just list the structure or steps on a scratch paper? That same method helps with main purpose too. Of course, however, it is a little different. The first thing I do when it comes to these questions is I read each line in the text and I try to recall it. So take a look at how I solve this. A study by Dr. Paul Hanel and colleagues concluded that people are more likely to behave politely when listening to ideas they disagree with if they think about values before they engage in a discussion. So this gives us a conclusion. Study participants were assigned to one of two groups. The experimental group spent a few minutes writing about one of their personal values before they had a group discussion on a controversial topic, and the control group spent a few minutes writing about a drink, tea, milk, etc. before their group discussion on that topic. So this shows the experiment setup. Then it says Hanel and colleagues found that the experimental group's discussion was more civil than the control group's discussion was. This shows the finding that led to the conclusion in the beginning. So overall, the main purpose of the text was to give us a conclusion and then shows the experiment that got them to that conclusion. Now let's compare our prediction to the choices. Choice A. Describe a widely held belief and how studies' results support that belief. No, it was a conclusion, not a widely held belief. Choice B. To argue that researchers were surprised by the results of a certain study. There was literally no argument and surprises. Choice C. to suggest ways to improve a certain study's experimental design. What ways? This doesn't even match our prediction. Choose D. To explain a study's conclusion and how a research team arrived at that conclusion. Yes, that matches our prediction. It says that the main purpose of the text was to give us a study's conclusion and how the team got to that conclusion. Many students think the next question type I'm going to talk about is the same as main purpose questions. However, it is completely different. I'm talking about the main idea questions. These questions are much harder because you actually need to understand everything going on in the text. I've seen lots of students quickly read the text and go to the choices, but they get confused because they think multiple of the choices are correct. So they go back to the text and get stressed because of the limited amount of time and they end up picking the wrong answer. However, I'll show you the method I use to solve these questions quickly and successfully almost every single time. Believing that living in an impractical space can heighten awareness and even improve health, conceptual artists Madeline Jins and Shusaku Arakawa designed an apartment building in Japan to be more fanciful than functional. Pause. Try to recall what you just read. I've seen lots of students read the text and they're completely zoned out. So each time I read, I try to recall what I just read. So in this case, I would say some artists believe that living in weirdly designed spaces is good for health, so they built a building like that. Then it says a kitchen counter is chest high on one side and knee high on the other. A ceiling has a door to nowhere. Okay, so the apartment structure is pretty weird. The effect is disorienting but invigorating. I don't know what invigorating means, so I'll keep on reading. After 4 years there, filmmaker Nobu Yamaoka reported significant health benefits. Okay, so it means that it makes them feel healthier. So, in summary, artists built an apartment with weird, impractical features. It was disorienting but made people feel healthier. So, the main idea of the text is probably going to be weirdly designed buildings may be impractical, but they're beneficial to our health. Let's look at the choices. Choice A says, although inhabiting a home surrounded by fanciful features such as those designed by Jins and Arakawa can be rejuvenating, it is unsustainable. So it says that the buildings are unsustainable, meaning that that it is really hard to handle living in. However, nowhere in the text is that mentioned. Plus, it does not match our prediction. Choose B. Designing disorienting spaces like those in the Jins and Arakawa building is the most effective way to create a physically stimulating environment. So we can see that it uses an extreme word over here, which is most. Whenever the choices are too extreme, so they use words like most, never, always, then it is usually the wrong answer. And in the text, it was never mentioned that it was the most physically stimulating. Plus, it does not match our prediction. Choice C. As a filmmaker, Yamaka has long supported the designs of conceptual artists such as Jins and Arakawa. Okay, is that really the main idea of the text? Was this entire text given to talk about how impractical spaces can be beneficial for our health? Or was this text given to talk about how filmmaker thinks? So this is not mentioned in the text and this does not matter prediction. Choose D. Although impractical, the design of the apartment building by Jinzen Arakawa may improve the well-being of the building's residents. Perfect. This says that weirdly designed places may be beneficial to our health. So this choice is correct. So with main idea questions, just reduce the whole passage or text to one sentence, then find the choice that says exactly that. Now let's see a question type that every single person hates. Cross-text connections. We'll first read and recall every line. So in text 1 it says, in a study of the benefits of having free time, Marissa Scher found that the reported sense of life satisfaction tended to plateau when participants had 2 hours of free time per day and actually began to fall when they had 5 hours of free time per day. This is saying the more free time they had in their day, they felt worse. After further research, Sheriff concluded that this dip in life satisfaction mainly occurred when individuals spent all their free time unproductively, such as by watching TV or playing games. This is saying they felt worse because they were spending their time unproductively. Text 2. Psychologist James Maddox cautions against suggesting an ideal amount of free time. The human desire for both free time and productivity is universal, but Maddox asserts that individuals have unique needs for life satisfaction. So this is saying that people have different needs for life satisfaction. Furthermore, he points out that there is no objective definition for what constitutes productivity. Reading a book might be considered a productive activity by some, but idleness by others. So the same activities that can make you feel productive might make another person feel unproductive. Now let's read the question. Based on the text, how would Maddox most likely respond to the conclusion Sheriff reached after her further research? So let's find differences between the two texts. We know that text 1 says this dip in life satisfaction mainly occurred when individuals spent all their free time unproductively, such as by watching TV or playing games, while text 2 says that each person has different needs for life satisfaction. So the person from text 2 would probably tell the person from text 1 that not all people think that watching TV or playing games is unproductive. Different people consider different things to be productive or unproductive. Now let's compare our prediction to the choices. Choice A. By acknowledging that free time is more likely to enhance life satisfaction when it is spent productively than when it is spent unproductively. The person from text 2 says that different people consider different things for life satisfaction, so this is probably wrong. Plus, it does not match our prediction. Choose B. By challenging the reasoning in text 1, as it has not been proved that productivity commonly contributes to individuals' life satisfaction. I don't think this makes sense and it does not match our prediction. So let's see the other choices. Choice C. By warning against making an overly broad assumption, as there is no clear consensus in distinguishing between productive and unproductive activities. Exactly. The person from text 2 says that different people consider different activities as productive or unproductive. Choose D. By claiming that the specific activities named in text 1 are actually examples of productive activities rather than unproductive ones. No, that is too broad, and it does not make sense, and is not what is mentioned in the text. So that means that choice is correct. So this is the SAT's way of asking, can you compare perspectives logically, not just summarize? Now, let's test that skill again, but this time with supporting and weakening questions from the command of textual evidence questions. Again, for these ones, we will read each line and recall it. After that, we will create a prediction based on the experiment and the conclusion. So it says male Tongara frogs make complex calls to attract mates, but their calls also attract frog-biting midges, insects that feed on the frog's blood. So these male frogs make sounds to attract female frogs, but the sounds also attract some insects that drink the frog's blood. Researchers Ximena Bernal and Priyanka De Silva wondered if the calls alone are sufficient for midges to locate the frogs, or if midges use carbon dioxide emitted by frogs as an additional cue to their prey's whereabouts, like mosquitoes do. So they were wondering if the sounds were the only thing attracting the bad insects, or is it also the carbon dioxide from the frogs that helps the bad insects find the frogs? In an experiment, the researchers placed two mid traps in a Tongara frog breeding area. One trap played recordings of Tongara frog calls, and the other released carbon dioxide along with playing the calls. So they made two cages or two traps. One of them had just the sounds, while the other had sounds and the carbon dioxide. Bernal and Silva concluded that the carbon dioxide does not serve as an additional cue to frog biting midges. Okay, so they found out that the carbon dioxide does not make insects find frogs easier. Which finding from the experiment, if true, would most directly support Bernal and De Silva's conclusion? So we need to use the experiment and the results of it to make a prediction. So since carbon dioxide had no impact, I would predict that the trap with just the sounds and the trap with the sounds and the carbon dioxide got the same amount of bad insects. So let's see which of the choices matches our prediction. Choice A. Only a small number of midges were found in the traps, though the majority were found in the trap that played calls and released carbon dioxide. This weakens the conclusion and it does not support it because the conclusion says carbon dioxide does not help the bad insects find the frogs. Choice B. Midges entered the trap that released carbon dioxide and played calls only during or immediately after periods of carbon dioxide release. Again, this weakens the conclusion and it does not match our prediction. Choose C. More midges were found in the trap that only played calls than in the trap that played calls and released carbon dioxide. This implies that carbon dioxide was not helping the bad insects to find the frogs more easily, so this supports the conclusion and the prediction. So this choice could be correct. However, let's see choice D. Choice D. The trap that released carbon dioxide in plate coals attracted few midges when carbon dioxide concentrations were low, but attracted many midges when carbon dioxide concentrations were high. Again, this goes against the conclusion and prediction. So, with most of these reading questions, the key is always to understand what the question wants from you. Then, you need to understand the text perfectly, and lastly, you need to form a prediction before checking the choices. Now, let's try the second type of command textual evidence questions that not many students talk about. However, I see lots of students struggle with them. I'm talking about quotation questions. There are two types of quotations. The first one asks for a quotation from the text, and the next one asks for a quotation from a poem. So again, like the previous command of textual evidence question that we just solved, we will read each line and recall it. Then we will create a prediction based on the experiment and conclusion, and we will compare it to the choices. Fish whose DNA has been modified to include genetic materials from other species are known as transgenic. So the fish's DNA has been modified to include other animals' DNA. Some transgenic fish have genes from jellyfish that result in fluorescence. That is, they glow in the dark. So some of the fish glow in the dark, okay? Although these fish were initially engineered for research purposes in the 1990s, they were sold as pets in the 2000s and can now be found in the wild and creeks in Brazil. So they were created for research, but they were then sold as pets. A student in a biology seminar who is writing a paper on these fish asserts that their escape from Brazilian fish farms into the wild may have significant negative long-term ecological effects. So the student thinks that these fish that glow in the dark may get affected negatively in the long run. Now, which quotation from a researcher would best support the student's assertion? So, why would the student think that? Well, if the fish glows in the dark, then other animals or predators might find the fish easily. So, I would predict the correct choice would say the fish's population might drastically decrease because they can be seen easily by predators. Now, let's compare our prediction to the choices. Choice A. In one site in the wild where transgenic fish were observed, females outnumbered males, while in another the number of females and males were equivalent. Where are the males and females mentioned in the text? They're not. Plus, this does not match our prediction. Choice B. Though some presence of transgenic fish in the wild has been recorded, there are insufficient studies of the impact of those fish on the ecosystems into which they are introduced. I feel like this weakens the claim, plus this does not match our prediction. Choice C. The ecosystems into which transgenic fish are known to have been introduced may represent a subset of the ecosystems into which the fish have actually been introduced. Again, like choice A, this is saying some random stuff and not talking about the things mentioned in the text. Also, this does not match our prediction. Choice D. Through interbreeding, transgenic fish might introduce the trait of fluorescence into wild fish populations, making those populations more vulnerable to predators. This is saying that the fish will slowly become more accessible for the predators to catch. And this matches our prediction and supports the claim or assertion. So choice D is correct. Now, let's see another quotation question. However, the quotation is based on a poem and not a regular text or passage. Lone Point is a 1912 poem by Amy Lowell. In the poem, which represents a nighttime scene on a body of water, Lowell describes an element of nature as an active participant in the experience, writing, okay, so which quotation from Lone Point most effectively illustrates the claim? So we need a quotation that A talks about the nighttime scene on water, and B makes another thing from nature a participant that is active and doing something. Choice A. Through the water, the moon writes her legends, in light on the smooth, wet sand. This talks about the water and the moon, meaning it is nighttime. Plus, it says the moon is writing her legends, so it is an active participant. It is doing something. So this could be correct. Choice B. Softly, the water ripples against the canoe's curving side. This mentions water, but not the nighttime scene. Plus, it does not mention anything else from nature being an active participant. So let's look at choice C. Or like the snow white petals which drop from an overblown rose. This does not even mention the water, so this is wrong. Choose D. But the moon in her wayward beauty is ever and always the same. This talks about the moon, but it does not talk about the water, and it does not show any active participants. Now, the next SAT question type seems scary to many students because of how long it looks. I'm talking about the command of quantitative evidence questions, or those graphical questions. By the way, if you're finding this video beneficial, leave a like and share it with your friends because it really does help the channel out. The first command of quantitative evidence question I'll talk about is the ones without the blank at the end. For these, I use the ARC method, which is to analyze the graph, read the conclusion, create a prediction, and compare it to the choices. Let's first analyze the table. If you first read the text before checking the table, you'll get confused because you don't have any context on the data and you will waste lots of time without clear direction on how to solve the question. However, if you analyze and understand the table first, you'll have context on the data. So when it talks about in text, you'll quickly understand it. So it says approximate rates of speech and information conveyed for 5 languages. And here it shows the 5 languages: Serbian, Spanish, Vietnamese, and so on. Then it shows the rate of speech, so how fast people talk in those languages. And then it shows the rate of information conveyed, so how much information is conveyed per second. So when the data makes sense on its own, I usually like to skip the entire text because it just restates the data. However, if the data mentions some weird names and looks really difficult, then read the entire text. What I think you should do on the real test is to read the conclusion only in Module 1, but read the whole thing on Module 2. So for this question, we'll just read the conclusion. It says, thus, they claim that 2 languages with very different spoken rates can nonetheless convey the same amount of information in a given amount of time. Okay, which choice best describes data from the table that supports the researcher's claim? So we need to look for a pair with very different speeds or rates of speech, but similar rate of information conveyed. I can see that these two have high rates of speech, relatively speaking, while the other 3 have low rates of speech. So we need to pick one from the high rate of speech and one from the low rate of speech. I can see that the rate of information conveyed for Spanish is similar to the rate of information conveyed in Vietnamese. This supports the claim because the claim wanted to compare 2 languages with significantly different rates of speech but similar rates of information conveyed. So Spanish has a much higher rate of speech while Vietnamese has a much lower rate of speech. But their rates of information conveyed is pretty close. So let's see which choice matches our prediction. Choice A. Among the 5 languages in the table, Thai and Hungarian have the lowest rates of speech and the lowest rates of information conveyed. No, this does not support the claim and does not match our prediction. If you also check, you will see that it does not match the data as well. However, if you clearly understand the claim and have a prediction, you don't need to waste your time checking the table. Choice B. Vietnamese conveys information at approximately the same rate as Spanish, despite being spoken at a slower rate. Yes, this matches our prediction and supports the claim and the data. But let's check the other choices. Choose C. Among the 5 languages in the table, the language that is spoken the fastest is also the language that conveys information the fastest. This does not support the claim and does not match our prediction, plus it goes against the data. Choose D. Serbian and Spanish are spoken at approximately the same rate, but Serbian conveys information faster than Spanish does. This does not support the claim and does not match our prediction, plus it goes against the data. You might have noticed that the incorrect choices all go against the data, so why not just compare the choices to the graph or table and see if they match? Well, sometimes the choices will match the graph or table, but it will go against the researcher's claim. So you cannot always do this. That's why having a prediction is so beneficial. It saves time and you have a clear direction on how to solve the question. Moving on to the next command of quantitative evidence question. However, this one has a blank at the end. For this one, ARC is a little different because we don't have a conclusion and we don't need a prediction. We will of course first analyze the graph. So I can see on the top it says percentage of maize exported by 3 countries from marketing years 2009, 2010 to 2013 until 2014. On the bottom it shows the years and on the left it shows the percentages from 0 to 100. you can see that this triangle ones represent Argentina and they're the highest. Then we have the square ones which represent Brazil. Then the circle ones that present the United States. Now that we've analyzed the graph and you understand all the details, let's read around the last two lines. So over here, a student is researching those percentages and finds that for the marketing year 2012-2013, the percentage of maize exported by blank. Moving on to the final step, which is to compare the choices to the graph. Choice A says, Brazil increased from the previous marketing year but remained lower than the percentage exported by the United States. This is talking about 2012-2013. So over here, and you can see that Brazil increased from the previous marketing year and not decreased. Choice B. Brazil exceeded the percentage exported by Argentina for the first time. No, this is of course wrong. In 2012-2013, Brazil was lower than Argentina. Choice C. Argentina decreased from the previous marketing year but remained the highest among the three countries. So I can see that it decreased from the previous year, and yes, it is the highest amongst the three countries. So choice C is correct. However, let's check choice D. The United States reached its highest point during the 5 marketing years. Nope, it actually hit its lowest point during the 5 marketing years. That was easy. However, the next question type is one where multiple of the choices seem correct and many students hate. I'm talking about inferences, or those questions that ask which choice most logically completes the text. For these questions, like most of the other questions, I'll first read each line and recall it. Then I'll predict what will come in the blank, and I'll compare my prediction to the choices. When the Vinland map, a map of the world purported to date to the mid-1400s, surfaced in 1957, some scholars believed it demonstrated that European knowledge of the eastern coast of present-day North America predated Christopher Columbus's 1492 arrival. So there was a map that was found in 1957, and people believed it was from the mid-1400s. Therefore, some scholars believed that it showed that the Europeans knew about a part of North America before Christopher Columbus's arrival in 1492. In 2021, a team including conservators Mary-France Lemay and Paula Ziatz and material scientist Enrico Bizur performed an extensive analysis of the map and the ink used. So a team did some analysis on the map and the ink used. They found that the ink contains titanium dioxide, a compound that was first introduced in ink manufacturing in the early 1900s. So they found that it contained ink that was created in the 1900s. Therefore, the team concluded that blank. Okay, so based on the text, I would predict that the map might not have been from the 1400s. It was probably from the 1900s because of the fact that the ink was not produced yet. Okay, which choice most logically completes the text? Choice A. Mid-1400s, Europeans could not have known about the eastern coast of present-day North America. Was this mentioned in the text? No, they never said that the Europeans could not have known about that part of North America. Choice B. The Vinland map could not have been drawn by mid-1400s map makers. Yeah, I guess this could be true because the map was probably made in the 1900s. Plus, that matches our predictions, so it is probably correct. Choice C. The map makers must have used titanium compounds in their inks in the 1400s. No, the text said that the ink was invented in the 1900s. Also, it says must, which is an extreme keyword. Plus, it does not match our predictions, so it is probably wrong. Choose D. There isn't enough information to determine when the ink was created. They literally said that the ink was created in the 1900s. Therefore, choice B is correct. So now that you understand exactly how I solve these questions, you now need to implement everything I taught you. But you're now so overwhelmed because you don't have a clear strategy on how to implement these strategies, right? Well, if you have 1 week or less left until your SAT and you need to boost your score by 50 to 170 plus points, then I highly recommend you watch this next video. Or if you want one-on-one help with me, you can join my SAT English Accelerator program and boost your score by 80 to 170 plus points. Click the link below to learn more.